My name is Valith Soran, and I have spent 40 cycles sitting behind a desk, cataloging the unremarkable ways in which the Thaleri Dominion loses things. A patrol ship drifts off course. A supply convoy runs into an asteroid cluster. A communications relay burns out on the edge of nowhere. I write reports about these events. I file them. I forget them. That is my entire career, and until 11 rotations ago, I had never once lost sleep over any of it. Then Fleet Korath 9 went quiet, and I have not slept since. The assignment landed on my datapad at mid-cycle, flagged as a standard follow-up. 12 warships under the command of Dorath K, a decorated officer with 30 cycles of unblemished service, had been dispatched to intercept an unidentified vessel traveling through Dominion-controlled space. The vessel was mid-sized, slow-moving, and broadcasting no weapons signatures of any kind. It had drifted into a logistical corridor near the outer boundary, the kind of empty stretch where nothing interesting ever happens. Dorath K had logged his pre-engagement assessment before making contact. I read it 3 times because I could not believe how short it was. One line. He wrote one single line. Minimal threat. Projecting full compliance upon contact. That was it. No tactical breakdown, no contingency planning, no secondary analysis. Just 5 words and a period. Dorath K had commanded the Dominion fleet for 3 decades, had fought the Rethon Confederacy in the border campaigns, and survived the machine swarms of the Outer Veil, and he looked at this lone vessel floating through empty space and decided it was not worth a second thought. I should have taken that as my first warning. The standard protocol after an interception is simple. The fleet commander files a contact report within 2 rotations. If the vessel cooperates, there is a short summary, a cargo manifest, and a clearance stamp. If the vessel resists, there is a longer report, a tactical log, and usually a few commendations for the officers involved. Either way, something comes back. Something always comes back. Nothing came back from Korath 9. I sent routine pings along the fleet's projected communication path. Every relay station in the sector responded normally. The signal routes were clear and unobstructed. There was no solar interference, no spatial distortion, no equipment failure anywhere along the chain. The infrastructure was perfect. The silence was absolute. He glanced at my report, shrugged, and told me that Dorath K probably forgot to file his paperwork. Dorath K had never forgotten to file paperwork in 30 cycles of service. Not once. By the 7th rotation, I had moved past the polite version of concern and into something sharper. I requisitioned the deep-range sensor buoy data from the region where the interception was supposed to have taken place. Sensor buoys are passive recorders, little automated stations that drift through space and capture everything within their range: energy signatures, movement patterns, gravitational shifts. They are the closest thing we have to an objective witness in the emptiness between stars. The data arrived on the 9th rotation, and that was when my hands started shaking. The buoy's records were partially corrupted. Not damaged in the way that happens when equipment fails. Overwritten. Something had released so much energy in such a concentrated area that it had scrambled the buoy's storage systems from thousands of units away. Whatever had happened in that stretch of space, it had been enormous. I spent 2 full rotations working with the data recovery team to pull clean information from the corrupted files. Most of it was gone forever. But we managed to extract one clean fragment, and it was worse than anything I had imagined. It was Fleet Korath 9's automated distress beacon. Every Thaleri warship carries one. It activates when the ship suffers critical damage, and it broadcasts a continuous emergency signal on every available frequency. The beacons are built to survive anything. They are shielded against radiation, impact, and extreme temperature. They are designed to keep broadcasting for years, even decades, even if the ship around them is reduced to dust. That is the entire point of them. No matter what happens, the beacon keeps calling. This beacon had activated and then terminated within 90 seconds. That should not be possible. The only way to shut down a distress beacon is manually, from the bridge, by a command-level officer. Even a direct hit to the ship should not stop the beacon. Even the complete destruction of the ship should not stop the beacon. It was designed to survive the death of everything around it, and keep screaming into the void until someone came. Someone had turned it off. In 90 seconds. "90 seconds. Not 90 minutes. Not 90 hours. 90 seconds between activation and silence. Whatever had hit Dorath K's flagship had been so fast, so thorough, so absolute, that the entire chain of command had been eliminated before anyone could even maintain the distress signal. I formally reclassified the case. The designation I used was one that had not been applied in the Thaleri Dominion in over 200 cycles. I requested the sensor buoy's visual telemetry next, knowing that even corrupted, it might hold fragments of imagery from the event. I opened it, I looked at it, and I understood, in a way that settled into my bones like cold water, that everything I thought I knew about the safety of our borders was wrong. The image was grainy and broken, shot through with static and reconstruction artifacts. But it was clear enough. There was a debris field, massive, spread across thousands of units. I could identify hull fragments, engine components, weapons arrays, all bearing the unmistakable markings of Thaleri military construction. 12 ships worth of wreckage, scattered across the void like someone had taken the most powerful fleet in the sector and simply torn it apart. And there, at the edge of the debris field, still moving, was the unknown vessel. It was damaged. I could see that even through the static. Its hull was scorched and torn in several places. Atmosphere was venting from at least 2 major breaches, streaming out into space in thin white trails. One of its engine sections was dark, either destroyed or shut down. Scorch marks covered nearly every visible surface. But the remaining engines were lit, bright and steady. It was still moving, not drifting, not tumbling, not dead in space. Moving, under power, on a heading, going somewhere. 12 Thaleri warships, 9,000 crew, 30 decades of military experience, under the most decorated commander in the fleet. And the vessel they had been sent to intercept, the vessel that Dorath K had dismissed with 5 words, was flying away from their remains like they had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience on a long journey. Then I sat in my office, alone, in the quiet hum of the archives, and I wrote the first line of my report. They engaged the vessel. The vessel did not stop. I did not know, when I wrote those words, how much worse it was going to get. I did not know what the salvage drones would find in that debris field. I did not know what the black box recordings would contain. I did not know what Dorath K's voice would sound like in his final moments, or what his soldiers would scream as they realized what they had walked into. I did not know any of that yet. All I had was an image, a dead fleet, and a vessel that was still flying. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I sat there, staring at that grainy, broken picture. I knew it the way you know that fire burns, or that the void is cold. I knew it in the deep, quiet part of my mind that had spent 40 cycles learning to read the patterns of disaster. Whatever had happened out there, it was not over. The vessel was still moving. It had somewhere to be. And nothing we had sent against it, nothing we had thrown at it, had been enough to change its mind. I closed my datapad, I locked my office, and for the first time in my career, I went home afraid. The salvage drone took 4 rotations to reach the debris field. 4 rotations of waiting, of checking my datapad every few minutes for an update, of sitting in the archives surrounded by 40 cycles of mundane reports, while something unprecedented sat at the edge of my awareness, like a shadow I could not shake. When the data finally arrived, I cleared my schedule, locked my office door, and told Rishan I was not to be disturbed. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before: concern. The fact that my behavior had finally unsettled him told me more about the situation than any report could. The drone's initial scan of the debris field confirmed what the sensor buoy image had suggested. 12 Thaliri warships, all destroyed. The identification markers from each vessel's hull were catalogued and matched against Fleet Korath 9's deployment roster. Every ship accounted for, every single one. But the wreckage told a story that I was not prepared for. I had assumed, when I first saw the image, that the fleet had been destroyed by some kind of advanced weaponry. A species with technology beyond our own, perhaps, or a hidden military installation that Dorath K had stumbled upon. That would have been terrifying enough. But the salvage data showed something far more unsettling. The scoring patterns on the hull fragments were wrong. Thaliri military technology is based on directed energy, plasma lances, particle beams, focused radiation arrays. Our weapons leave distinctive marks. Smooth, melted channels with crystallized edges, where the metal cooled after being superheated. Every spacefaring species we have encountered uses some variation of directed energy weaponry. It is the obvious progression. You discover physics, you harness energy, you learn to focus it into a beam that can cut through anything. The marks on the Korath 9 wreckage were not smooth. They were rough, jagged, punched. The salvage drone's analysis identified them as kinetic impacts. Solid projectiles, accelerated by chemical propellant, striking the hull at high velocity. I read that assessment 3 times, certain there had been an error. Chemical propellant. The technology was ancient, primitive. The Thaliri had abandoned chemical ballistic weapons thousands of cycles ago, in the earliest days of our expansion into space. Every advanced species in the known galaxy had done the same. It was a stepping stone, a phase you pass through on the way to real technology. Using chemical projectiles against military-grade shielding would be like trying to break down a reinforced door by throwing pebbles at it. Except the hull fragments told a different story. The drone counted the impact marks on a single recovered panel from the destroyer Velithone. 412 individual strikes on one panel. 412. The panel was roughly 2 units across. That meant over 200 kinetic impacts per square unit on that section alone. And the drone noted that the panel showed signs of multiple layers of damage, suggesting that the projectiles had been fired in sustained, overlapping bursts, not single shots. Streams. I pulled up the impact analysis for the rest of the debris field. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of kinetic strikes distributed across the wreckage. Not precision targeting, not careful aimed shots designed to hit specific systems. Volume. Overwhelming, relentless, unimaginable volume. They had simply filled the space around our ships with so much metal that the shielding could not compensate. Our shields are designed to absorb and redirect directed energy. They are elegantly calibrated, tuned to the specific frequencies and energy signatures of plasma and particle weapons. They are among the best defensive systems in the galaxy, and they had been beaten by a species that pointed tubes full of metal at them and refused to stop pulling the trigger. I sat back in my chair and tried to process what I was reading. The technical implications alone were staggering, but the tactical implications were worse. A species that used kinetic weapons at this scale was not fighting the way we understood combat. They were not trying to outsmart our defenses. They were trying to overwhelm them, and they had succeeded. The salvage drone found something else in the debris field that shifted my understanding even further. Several of the destroyed warships showed damage patterns that were inconsistent with external weapons fire. The destroyer Korath 7, for example, had been torn apart from the inside. Its reactor housing had been breached from within, not from without. The explosion that destroyed it had started in the engineering section and worked outward, which meant that something had gotten inside the ship and fought its way to the most critical system on board. 3 other ships showed similar internal damage: breached corridors, shattered bulkheads, scorch marks on interior walls. The drone's forensic analysis identified residue from chemical explosives, the same propellant-based technology as the kinetic weapons, inside the ships. Whoever had fought Fleet Korath 9 had not just shot at our warships from the outside. They had gone in. The most important piece of data the salvage drone recovered was a partial data core from Dorath K's flagship. It was damaged, cracked by the forces that had destroyed the ship, but the recovery team managed to extract approximately 60% of its contents. I started with the engagement logs. The interception had begun exactly as planned. Dorath K had broadcast a universal surrender demand on every frequency, in every known language, using the mathematical signal patterns that any sufficiently advanced species should recognize. The vessel did not respond. Dorath K logged a note about a possible language barrier and ordered his communications team to cycle through additional signal types. Still nothing. The vessel continued on its original heading, as if the 12 warships surrounding it simply did not exist. The passive scans of the vessel had come back with a profile that supported Dorath K's initial assessment. Mid-sized construction, no military-grade power signatures, moderate shielding, well below Thaleri standards. The hull was thick, but composed of simple alloys. Nothing exotic. The engine output suggested capability for moderate speed, but nothing that could outrun a Thaleri cruiser. In every measurable way, the vessel was unremarkable. Dorath K ordered a warning shot. Standard protocol. A single low-power plasma discharge aimed across the vessel's bow, close enough to demonstrate capability, but far enough to avoid damage. A universal message: we are here, we are armed, and you should pay attention. The shot passed within 50 units of the vessel's forward hull. And that was the moment everything changed. I watched the engagement logs shift in real time as I read them. The tone of the data changed. The calm, methodical rhythm of a routine interception was replaced by something frantic, confused, and increasingly desperate. Within seconds of the warning shot, the unknown vessel began to move. Not away, not in evasion. It turned. Slowly, deliberately, like something ancient and heavy, waking from a long sleep. It oriented its broadside toward Dorath K's flagship, and then it revealed what it had been hiding. Every surface of that vessel came alive. Panels retracted. Ports opened. Turrets deployed from recesses that the passive scans had identified as cargo bays. Missile racks extended from the ventral hull. Point defense systems, dozens of them, emerged along the dorsal spine. And from the forward section, a battery of weapons that Dorath K's sensors could not even classify unfolded like the petals of some terrible flower. The vessel opened fire on all of them simultaneously. The engagement logs recorded the next 90 seconds in a cascade of alerts, damage reports, and increasingly urgent communications between the ships. The kinetic weapons struck first, thousands of projectiles per second, hammering against the shields of every ship in the formation. The missiles came next, slower but heavier, arcing on indirect trajectories that forced the point defense systems to split their attention. And then the unidentified weapons, the ones Dorath K's sensors could not classify, deployed something the logs described as dense swarms of tiny autonomous objects, each one no larger than a fist, moving independently and with apparent intelligence. The swarms did not attack immediately. They spread out, probing the shield perimeters of each warship, testing frequencies and intensities with a methodical precision that stood in sharp contrast to the raw chaos of the kinetic barrage. It took me a moment to understand what they were doing. Then I realized, and the realization made something cold settle in my chest. They were mapping our defenses. In real time, what I read made me push back from my desk and stand up, because I could not process it while sitting down. The vessel was not a warship. Its identification code classified it as a colonial transport. A vessel designed to carry settlers, equipment, and supplies to establish new communities on distant worlds. The decoded fragment included a partial cargo manifest, agricultural machinery, prefabricated shelter components, medical equipment, educational materials, and genetic stock for livestock cultivation. It was a ship built to start a new home. The weapons that had just engaged 12 Thaleri warships were listed in the vessel's technical specifications as defensive contingency systems, secondary armaments, backup measures installed as a precaution against unknown threats during long-distance transit. This was what they carried in their back pocket, in case something went wrong on the way to building a farm. And it had just engaged the most powerful interception fleet in the sector, without hesitation, without communication, without any apparent concern that it was outnumbered 12 to 1. I stood in my office, alone, holding a data pad that contained information I did not want to believe, and I understood for the first time that Dorath K had not made a mistake in his assessment of the threat. He had made the same assessment that any rational officer would make when confronted with a single unarmed-looking vessel in empty space. The mistake was not his. The mistake was ours. All of ours. We had looked at this species and seen something primitive, something manageable, something beneath our concern, and we had been catastrophically wrong. I saved the data. I filed the preliminary analysis. And then I went back to the black box recordings. Because I needed to understand what had happened next. I needed to hear it. I needed to hear how Dorath K, the most experienced commander in the Thaleri fleet, had spent the last hours of his life discovering exactly how wrong we had all been. The recovered black box data from Dorath K's flagship contained approximately 4 hours of continuous recording. I reconstructed the timeline as carefully as I could, cross-referencing the flagship's logs with fragmentary data recovered from 3 other vessels in the fleet. What emerged was a picture of a battle that I believe has no precedent in the recorded history of the Thaleri Dominion, and perhaps no precedent in the recorded history of any species we have encountered. The first phase of the engagement lasted roughly 20 minutes. The initial barrage from the Earth vessel, the kinetic weapons, the missiles, the autonomous swarms, had been dramatic and unexpected. But Dorath K's fleet was not defenseless. Their shields absorbed the kinetic fire with moderate strain. Their point defense systems intercepted the majority of the incoming missiles. The autonomous swarms were a nuisance, probing and mapping, but they had not yet launched any direct offensive action. 20 minutes in, Dorath K's fleet had sustained shield depletion averaging 30%, but no structural damage to any vessel. Dorath K's voice in the logs during this phase was controlled, professional, and only slightly annoyed. He had expected a quick surrender and instead gotten a fight, but it was a fight he believed he was winning. He ordered concentrated return fire on the Earth vessel, targeting its engines to disable it for boarding. The plasma lances struck true. 3 direct hits on the vessel's propulsion section. The telemetry confirmed penetration through the vessel's shielding, which was far weaker than Thaleri military standard. One of the engine clusters went dark. The vessel began to list, its trajectory shifting as it lost thrust on one side. Boarding in 3 marks. He was not wrong about the damage. The Earth vessel had been genuinely hurt by the plasma strikes. One engine cluster was destroyed, and the adjacent hull section was venting atmosphere. He assumed that a crippled ship would behave like a crippled ship. He assumed it would slow down, attempt to negotiate, or at the very least, shift to a defensive posture. The kinetic barrage, which had been firing in broad covering patterns, suddenly narrowed. The projectiles were now aimed at specific points on specific ships. I reviewed the targeting data and realized what had happened. The autonomous swarms, the tiny machines that had been probing our shields during the first phase, had completed their analysis. They had identified the resonance frequencies of our shield generators, the cycling patterns of our energy distribution, and the structural weak points where the shielding was thinnest. They had used the first 20 minutes of the battle as a test. Every shot they fired, every probe they sent, every impact they absorbed, had been feeding data into whatever tactical system was running aboard that vessel. They had let us hit them. They had let us feel confident. The narrowed kinetic fire struck the weak points with devastating accuracy. The destroyer Marath, positioned on the fleet's left flank, lost its forward shield generator to a concentrated burst that found the exact gap in its coverage that the swarms had identified. The kinetic rounds punched through the unshielded hull section and struck the sensor array, blinding the ship on one side. Before the crew could compensate, a missile arrived through the gap, moving on a trajectory that had been calculated to exploit the momentary shield failure. The Marath survived the missile impact, but its forward section was heavily damaged, and its commanding officer reported that the fire control system was offline. Dorath K ordered the ship to fall back behind the formation. They had been passive until now, mapping and probing. But the moment the Marath's shields dropped, the swarms nearest to the damaged destroyer shifted from reconnaissance to attack. Hundreds of the tiny machines converged on the exposed hull section and began to do something that Dorath K's sensors struggled to classify. They were cutting. Each machine carried a miniaturized plasma torch, barely powerful enough to warm a meal, but applied by hundreds of machines simultaneously to the same structural points. They sliced through the Marath's hull plating like water through sand. They were inside the ship within minutes. The Marath's internal security teams engaged them, but the machines were small, fast, and numerous. They did not fight like soldiers. They fought like insects, swarming through corridors, crawling through ventilation systems, and targeting specific internal systems with a precision that suggested they already knew the layout of the ship. Which I realized later, they probably did. They had been scanning our vessels for 20 minutes. They knew where everything was. The Marath went dark 12 minutes after the swarms breached its hull. Internal explosions, triggered by the machines reaching the reactor containment systems, tore the ship apart from within. 400 crew. Gone. Dorath Key's reaction in the logs was immediate and forceful. He ordered a full fleet bombardment. No more surgical strikes. No more attempts to disable. He wanted the Earth vessel destroyed. The Earth vessel deployed a countermeasure that no one in the fleet had ever seen before. From ports along its hull, it ejected thousands of objects into the surrounding space. Metal fragments, reflective particles, dense clouds of material that expanded rapidly into a shimmering curtain between the vessel and the incoming fire. The plasma lances struck the curtain and scattered. The focused beams, designed to cut through military shielding, were diffused by the reflective debris into a brilliant but harmless light show that illuminated the battlefield like a false sunrise. Through the fading light, a single missile emerged from the Earth vessel's launch tubes. It moved faster than anything the fleet's tracking systems had registered during the battle, accelerating at a rate that suggested a propulsion method different from the chemical rockets that had powered the earlier missiles. It covered the distance between the Earth vessel and the destroyer Velith Own in less than 3 seconds. Too fast for point defense, too fast for shield adjustment, too fast for anything. The missile struck the Velith Own in its reactor housing. The ship ceased to exist. There was no dramatic explosion, no slow breakup, no time for escape pods or emergency protocols. The reactor went critical in a fraction of a second, and the Velith Own became light and heat, and an expanding sphere of debris that forced the adjacent ships to execute emergency maneuvers to avoid the shockwave. 2 ships down. 900 crew lost in minutes. Dorath K's voice in the logs changed after the Velith Own. The professional calm was gone. What replaced it was something I recognized from my decades of studying military records. The particular tone of a commander who has just realized that the situation is fundamentally different from what he believed it to be. He ordered a close-range assault. 4 warships would move in, breach the Earth vessel's hull at multiple points, and deploy boarding teams to take the ship from within. It was a risky strategy, but Dorath K reasoned that the vessel's weapons, however effective at range, could not target his ships if they were docked against the hull. He was right about that. What he was wrong about was everything else. The 4 ships closed the distance under heavy fire, losing shield capacity with every second but maintaining structural integrity. They reached the Earth vessel and deployed magnetic docking clamps, latching onto the hull at 4 points along the port side. Boarding tubes extended and sealed. The assault teams, Thaleri soldiers in full combat armor, entered the vessel. For approximately 6 minutes, the boarding teams reported normal progress. The interior of the Earth vessel was strange to them, built on a scale, and with an aesthetic that was unfamiliar, but navigable. The corridors were wide, the compartments large, the lighting harsh and white. The boarding team leaders reported that the vessel appeared to be structured more like a habitat than a warship, with living quarters, communal spaces, and areas that resembled gardens or agricultural zones. Then they encountered the humans. The first contact reports were confused and fragmentary. The boarding team leader on Entry Point 2, a senior officer whose name the corrupted logs only partially preserved, reported encountering a group of approximately 20 humans in a large open compartment. He described them as bipedal, roughly similar in size to a Thaleri, wearing no armor, carrying no visible military equipment. Some of them were holding tools. Others appeared to be unarmed entirely. The humans did not respond to the demand. They looked at the boarding team. They looked at each other. And then, without any visible signal or command structure, they attacked. Not with weapons, not with technology, with everything they had. They threw tools. They rushed forward in groups, grabbing at the soldiers' armor, trying to pull weapons from their hands. They used pieces of furniture, metal pipes torn from the walls, pieces of equipment ripped from their mountings. One of them, the boarding team leader reported with audible disbelief, picked up a heavy machine part that should have required mechanical assistance to lift, and swung it with enough force to crack a soldier's helmet visor. The boarding teams opened fire. They dropped the first wave of humans in seconds. It should have been over. In any tactical manual, in any training scenario, in any rational understanding of combat, unarmed civilians charging armored soldiers with hand tools should have been over before it began. It was not over. More came. From every corridor, every compartment, every direction. They came running, walking, limping. Some of them were old, some of them were barely adult. Some of them were carrying children with one arm, and something sharp with the other. They were not soldiers. The boarding teams could see that clearly. These were engineers, medical workers, agricultural specialists, teachers, civilians, every single one of them, and every single one of them was fighting. The reports from the 4 boarding teams became increasingly frantic over the next several minutes. The humans did not fight with any recognizable tactical structure. There were no formations, no coordinated maneuvers, no chain of command that the Thaleri could identify and disrupt. They fought as individuals, each one making independent decisions, adapting to the situation in real time, exploiting every opportunity with a creativity that the soldiers found deeply disorienting. One boarding team reported that a group of humans had sealed a corridor behind them and begun cutting through the deck plating to access the level below, bypassing the soldiers entirely to reach a critical junction in the ship's infrastructure. Another team reported that the humans had activated the vessel's internal fire suppression system, flooding the corridors with a dense chemical foam that blinded the Thaleri sensors while leaving the humans, who apparently knew the layout of their own ship well enough to navigate it without sight, unaffected. The boarding team leader at Entry Point 3 reported something that I have read dozens of times and still cannot fully reconcile with my understanding of biological behavior. A single human, a female identified by the translation matrix as a medical specialist named Claire Morgan, had positioned herself in a narrow corridor between the boarding team and what appeared to be a compartment full of children. She was unarmed. She was not wearing any protective equipment. When the soldiers advanced toward her, she did not move. She did not run. She did not attempt to surrender. She stood in that corridor, and she fought them with her bare hands, grabbing at their weapons, throwing her body against them, clawing and striking at every exposed joint and visor gap she could reach. The soldiers neutralized her. It took 3 of them, and when they moved past her position toward the compartment she had been defending, they found it empty. She had not been trying to win. She had been buying time. And she had known, the boarding team leader noted in his report with a tone that I can only describe as shaken. She had known that she would not survive it. She had chosen to stand there and fight anyway, because the alternative was to let them pass. That was the moment I put down the data pad and walked to my window and stood there for a long time, looking out at the stars, trying to understand what kind of species produces individuals who make that choice. Not soldiers, not warriors bred for combat and trained to accept sacrifice. A medical specialist, a doctor, someone whose entire purpose was to preserve life. And when the moment came, she spent hers like currency, buying 30 seconds for a group of children she would never see again. I returned to the logs eventually. I had to. But I will not pretend that I was the same person when I sat back down. The boarding operations deteriorated rapidly after the first 15 minutes. The humans' resistance was not weakening. It was intensifying. Every compartment the soldiers cleared was reoccupied within minutes by humans who came through access routes the Thaleri had not mapped. The vessel's internal systems, controlled by the humans, became weapons in themselves. Atmosphere vented from compromised sections. Artificial gravity fluctuated wildly in contested corridors. Internal doors sealed and locked without warning, trapping squads in isolated pockets where the humans could engage them in close quarters. And then the humans stopped merely defending. The boarding team at Entry Point 4 reported that a group of approximately 30 humans had pushed past their defensive perimeter and entered the boarding tube that connected the Earth vessel to the Thaleri warship docked against its hull. They were not retreating into the tube. They were advancing through it, toward the Thaleri ship. They were counterboarding. Dorath K received this report and immediately ordered the docking clamps released and the boarding tube severed. But the humans had anticipated this. Someone aboard the Earth vessel, one of those engineers or mechanics or whoever was coordinating their impossible resistance, had accessed the docking clamp control frequency and locked it. The Thaleri ships could not detach. Humans poured through the boarding tubes into 4 Thaleri warships simultaneously. They were armed now, carrying weapons taken from fallen soldiers, tools repurposed into crude but effective instruments of damage, and in some cases pieces of their own ship that they had torn free and sharpened. The Thaleri crews fought them in their own corridors, on their own ground, with every advantage of familiarity and equipment. It was not enough. The humans moved through the Thaleri ships with a speed and ferocity that the internal security teams could not match. They did not try to capture the ships. They did not try to take prisoners. They had one objective, and they pursued it with a single-minded intensity that the logs describe in terms I have never seen in a military report before. They went straight for the reactors. The first of the 4 docked warships lost its reactor containment 18 minutes after the humans breached its hull. The explosion triggered a chain reaction that damaged the second docked ship so severely that its crew was forced to evacuate. The third ship managed to sever its boarding tube by physically cutting through the structure from the inside, but not before a group of humans had already entered the ship and begun their push toward engineering. The fourth ship, the heavy cruiser Doron, survived the longest. Its internal security teams managed to contain the human advance for nearly 40 minutes, fighting a running battle through the ship's lower decks. The commander of the Doron, an officer named Seelith Vaughn, transmitted a status report to Dorath K during the fighting. Her voice was calm, but the sounds in the background of the transmission told a different story. Weapons fire, alarms, and underneath it all, a sound that Seelith Vaughn described as screaming, though she clarified that it was not the screaming of pain or fear, it was something else, something she did not have a word for. Not in agony, in fury, in something primal and terrible that came from a place beyond tactics or training. They were outnumbered, outgunned, fighting in an alien environment against an enemy they had never seen before. And they were screaming, as though the universe owed them something, and they intended to collect. Seelith Vaughn's last transmission was 9 words long. She said them quietly, almost gently, as if she were stating something so obvious that it did not require emphasis. The Dorothon's reactor failed 4 minutes later. The explosion destroyed what remained of the fourth docked ship as well, and the combined detonation sent a shockwave through the battlefield that forced the remaining ships to scatter. In 1 hour and 43 minutes, the humans had boarded 4 Thaleri warships and destroyed them all from within, using weapons they had picked up off the floor and fury they had apparently been carrying with them all along. I saved my analysis, and I wrote a single observation in the margin of my report, a note I intended to delete later but never did. They did not fight like soldiers. They fought like something that has forgotten it is possible to lose. Dorath K had 7 warships remaining. 7 warships, fully armed, fully crewed, against a single colony transport that was burning from multiple hull breaches, missing an engine cluster, and had just lost a significant portion of its own structure in the destruction of the 4 docked warships. By any rational measure, the battle should have been over. The mathematics were simple and overwhelming. 7 warships. 1 crippled ship. The outcome should have been inevitable. Dorath K ordered a retreat. I read that order in the logs and I understood it, even as something in me recoiled from it. He was not a coward. 30 cycles of decorated service proved that beyond any question. But he had just watched 4 of his ships destroyed from within by civilians with hand tools, and the fundamental calculus of the engagement had changed in his mind. He was no longer fighting an inferior opponent. He was no longer certain he was fighting a sane opponent. He needed distance. He needed time to regroup, to analyze, to understand what he was facing before he committed his remaining forces. It was the most reasonable decision he could have made. It was also the wrong one. The moment the fleet began to pull away, the Earth vessel did something that Dorath K's tactical officers described in their logs with a single word that carried more weight than any detailed analysis could have conveyed. They wrote, "Impossible." The vessel pursued. Its remaining engines, the ones that had not been destroyed by Thaleri plasma fire, flared to full power. The crippled, burning, atmosphere-venting colony transport oriented itself toward the retreating fleet and accelerated. Not away from the battle, not toward safety, after them. But that was not the impossible part. The impossible part was the engines. The sensor logs from the retreating fleet showed the Earth vessel's propulsion output climbing steadily over a period of approximately 30 minutes. The engine cluster that had been destroyed by Dorath K's initial strike was still dark, still dead, but the remaining engines were producing thrust well beyond their rated capacity. The thermal signatures from the propulsion section were extreme, suggesting the engines were being pushed far past their safety limits. The vessel was tearing itself apart to go faster. And the logs showed something else. In the area surrounding the destroyed engine cluster, the fleet's long-range sensors detected movement. Small figures, dozens of them, moving on the exterior hull of the vessel in what appeared to be environmental suits. They were working, cutting away damaged sections, welding new supports, rerouting power conduits from the destroyed cluster to the surviving engines. They were repairing their ship, while chasing a fleet of warships, while their vessel was on fire, while the void of space pressed against the thin fabric of their suits, and nothing but their own hands and their own will stood between them and oblivion. Dorath K's tactical officer calculated the repair timeline and reported to the commander that at their current rate, the human repair crews would have partial thrust restored to the damaged engine cluster within 2 hours. The tactical officer added, in a note that I suspect was intended to be reassuring, that the fleet could easily outrun the vessel and maintain safe distance until reinforcements arrived. Dorath K responded with a single question. What reinforcements? He was right to ask. Fleet Korath 9 had been assigned to this sector alone. The nearest Thaliri military assets were 6 rotations away at maximum speed. There were no reinforcements. There was no fallback position. There was no one coming to help. And the Earth vessel was getting faster. Over the next 90 minutes, the gap between the retreating fleet and the pursuing vessel narrowed. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the human repair crews achieved what Dorath K's engineers told him should have been impossible. Partial restoration of thrust from a destroyed engine cluster, accomplished in vacuum, under combat conditions, using tools and materials scavenged from their own damaged ship. The destroyer Kethan, the slowest ship in the remaining formation, fell behind the others. Its engine efficiency had been degraded by shrapnel damage from the earlier explosions, and it could not maintain the pace. The Earth vessel closed on it like a predator, isolating the weakest member of a herd. The Kethan's commanding officer, a young captain named Roth Ilan, attempted to buy time by turning to face the approaching vessel and opening fire. His plasma lances struck the Earth vessel's hull, adding new scorch marks to the dozens already there. The vessel did not slow down, it did not change course, it did not fire back. It rammed the Kethan at full speed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of colonial transport, driven by engines that were burning beyond their limits, struck the Thaliri destroyer amidships. The impact was catastrophic. The Kethan folded around the collision point like paper, its structural frame collapsing inward as the Earth vessel's mass drove through it. Both ships were destroyed in the impact, the Kethan instantly, and the forward section of the Earth vessel, crumpling like a fist, driven into a wall. But before the collision, the sensor logs captured something that made me read the data 3 times to confirm I was not misunderstanding. In the final seconds before impact, dozens of objects launched from the Earth vessel's hull. They were not missiles. They were not drones. They were escape pods. The escape pods did not follow evacuation trajectories. They did not move towards safe space or attempt to clear the blast radius. They were aimed at the remaining Thaliri ships. Each pod was carrying between 3 and 8 humans, and each pod was on an intercept course with a specific warship. The humans had turned their own escape pods into boarding craft, improvised, desperate, and aimed with a precision that suggested someone aboard the Earth vessel had calculated the trajectories in the middle of a ramming maneuver and launched them at exactly the right moment. 2 pods reached the destroyer Sorith before its point defense systems could react. They struck the hull at high velocity, the impact itself breaching the outer plating, and the humans inside came through the holes they had made into the ship's interior. They were injured. Several of them had clearly been hurt by the impact of their own arrival. It did not matter. They fought with what they had and what they could find, moving through the Sorith's corridors with the same terrifying purpose that had characterized the earlier boarding actions. The Sorith's crew fought them. Corridor by corridor, deck by deck, compartment by compartment. The internal security teams had learned from the earlier disaster and had reinforced the approaches to engineering. The humans could not reach the reactor, so they found something else to destroy. Instead of pushing for the reactor, the human boarders changed direction and fought their way to the Sorith's bridge. The bridge crew sealed the command center, but the humans cut through the door using a plasma torch taken from a maintenance locker. They entered the bridge and destroyed the navigation and communication systems before the security teams could stop them. The Sorith was left blind, deaf, and unable to coordinate with the rest of the fleet. When the security teams finally reached the bridge, they found all 8 humans had been killed. They had known they were going to die when they changed course for the bridge. They had chosen to spend their lives disabling the ship's brain, rather than attempting an escape that might have saved them. Dorath K received reports of boarding actions on 3 other ships. The escape pods had been effective. Humans were inside his fleet. Small groups of 5 or 10, fighting with improvised weapons in alien corridors they had never seen before, and they were doing damage out of all proportion to their numbers. His fleet was falling apart, not because the humans were stronger, not because they were more advanced, not because they had better weapons or better ships or better training. They were falling apart because the humans simply would not stop. Every time Dorath K thought the threat was contained, the humans adapted. Every time he neutralized one attack, they launched another from a direction he had not anticipated. They fought with a creativity and desperation that his tactical training had never prepared him for, because no tactical training in the galaxy prepares you for an opponent who treats their own survival as a secondary concern. Dorath K's final transmission was recorded by the passive sensors on the deep-range buoy. His fleet's own communications array had been damaged by the humans who had boarded the Sorith, and his signal was weak, fragmented, and clearly not intended for anyone to hear. He was speaking into his personal log, recording his thoughts for whoever might eventually find the wreckage. His voice was calm, not the forced calm of someone maintaining discipline under pressure, but the genuine calm of a man who has passed through fear and come out the other side into something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding. I have never known fear until today. These creatures are not more advanced than us. They are not stronger. They are not faster. Their technology is crude. Their ships are primitive. Their weapons are loud, inelegant, and unsophisticated. But they refuse to recognize that they have been beaten. They simply refuse. And that makes them more dangerous than anything I have ever faced. We hurt them. We hurt them badly. Their ship is in ruins. We have killed hundreds of them. And they are still coming. They are inside my ship right now. I can hear them in the corridors below the bridge. They are cutting through the deck. There are maybe 10 of them. I have 200 crew on this vessel, and I am not certain that 200 is enough. The transmission ended mid-sentence. The flagship's data core recorded 3 more minutes of sensor data before it failed. In those 3 minutes, the internal sensors showed the human boarders reaching the bridge level. The last data point from the flagship was a thermal spike in the reactor housing, consistent with a deliberate breach of containment protocols. Dorath K's flagship was the last ship to fall. The entire engagement, from the first warning shot to the final explosion, had lasted approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. 0 survivors from Fleet Korath 9, 12 warships, over 9,000 Thaleri crew. All gone. I checked the Earth vessel's projected course after the battle. The colony transport, or what remained of it, had not stopped. The navigation data embedded in the captured signal fragment showed its destination. A star system in an unclaimed sector. A yellow-white sun, with 3 rocky inner worlds, and a habitable moon around the 4th gas giant. The vessel was going to start a colony. That had always been its purpose. That was where it had been headed when Dorath K intercepted it. And that was where it continued heading after it had destroyed his entire fleet. The sensor buoy's final image showed the vessel, broken and burning, its hull torn open in a dozen places, half its engines destroyed, trailing debris and atmosphere like blood from a wound, still accelerating toward its destination. It had not deviated from its original course by a single degree. I wrote the conclusion of my tactical analysis with hands that would not stop trembling. They did not win because they were superior. They won because they simply did not stop. We killed hundreds of them. They kept coming. We destroyed their ship around them. They used the wreckage as weapons. We boarded them. They followed us home. It was the longest document I had produced in my entire career, running to several hundred pages of analysis, reconstructed timelines, and technical assessments. I should have filed it, submitted it to the Dominion's Military Council, and moved on to the next case. That is what the protocol required. That is what Rishan expected me to do. I did not do that. Instead, I did something I had never done in 40 cycles as an archivist. I needed to understand them. Not their weapons, not their tactics, not their ship designs. I needed to understand what they were. What kind of organism fights the way they fought? What kind of civilization produces colony ships that can destroy military fleets? What kind of mind looks at 12 warships and decides that the correct response is to charge? I started with our own records. The Thaleri Dominion has been a spacefaring civilization for over 6,000 cycles. In that time, we have cataloged hundreds of species across this arm of the galaxy. Surely, somewhere in that vast archive, someone had encountered these humans before. The search results were almost empty. A handful of intercepted electromagnetic transmissions from a small yellow star on the outer edge of the galactic arm, detected decades ago and filed as curiosities. A long-range cultural survey conducted by a Thaleri science vessel that had passed through the region without making direct contact, and a single diplomatic file from an unexpected source, the Rethaman Confederacy. The Rethaman are not our allies. They are not precisely our enemies either, though we have fought them twice in my lifetime. They are the largest military power in the known galaxy, a civilization that has built its entire identity around the concept of martial excellence. Their fleets are legendary. Their soldiers are considered the finest in known space. When the Rethans speak about warfare, every species in the galaxy listens. The Rethon diplomatic file on the species designated as human contained 9 words. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not enter their space. Below that, a single notation. No further comment. I stared at those 9 words for a long time. The Rethon do not issue warnings lightly. They do not acknowledge threats they consider beneath them, and they do not refuse to elaborate, unless the subject is something they genuinely do not wish to discuss. I contacted the Rethon liaison attached to our diplomatic exchange, a tall, gray-skinned officer named Korath Den, who had been posted to our sector for the past several cycles. I had spoken with him perhaps twice before, brief professional exchanges about routine matters. He was not someone I knew well. I told him about Fleet Korath 9. I told him about the colony transport. I asked him what the Rethon knew about humans. Korath Den was silent for a very long time. In Rethon culture, silence is not uncomfortable. It is a sign of thought, of respect for the weight of a question. But this silence went on longer than any I had experienced in his presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from the measured, diplomatic tone I was accustomed to. It was quieter, careful. We sent a fleet once, he said, larger than yours. 60 warships. The finest vessels in the Confederacy, commanded by our most celebrated admiral. They entered the humans' home system to conduct what we considered a routine dominance assessment. We expected to demonstrate our superiority, establish a hierarchy, and depart. That is what the Rethon do. That is what we have always done. He paused again, and in that pause, I heard something I would never have expected to hear from a Rethon officer. I heard the echo of an old wound. We do not speak of what happened, he continued. The records are sealed at the highest level of our military command. What I can tell you is this. Of 60 warships, 4 returned. The admiral was not among the survivors. The humans did not pursue the retreating ships. They did not attempt to negotiate or communicate after the battle. They simply went back to what they had been doing before we arrived. As if we had been an interruption, a minor inconvenience in their day. He looked at me with eyes that held something I never expected to see in a Rethon. Not fear exactly. Respect. The kind of respect that comes from meeting something that has proven, beyond any possibility of denial, that it is your equal or your better. Your fleet was 12 ships, he said. Ours was 60. The outcome was the same. The scale does not matter. The technology does not matter. The numbers do not matter. They fight differently from anything in this galaxy. Not better, not smarter. Differently, in a way that none of our models or training can account for. My advice to you, Archivist, is the same advice that has been carved into the wall of our military academy since the day the 4 surviving ships came home. I thanked him and ended the communication. Then I sat in my office and thought about what he had said, and about what I had seen in the battle data, and about that image of the colony transport still burning, still flying, still going wherever it was going, despite everything we had done to stop it. Then I opened the long-range cultural survey. The Thaleri science vessel that had conducted the survey had done so from extreme distance, analyzing the human's homeworld and its surrounding space without making contact. The survey was limited, fragmentary, and decades old. But what it contained was enough to make me understand why the Rethyon had sealed their records and carved their warning into a wall. Constantly, their recorded history, as far as the survey could determine from intercepted transmissions, was a continuous catalog of conflict. They fought over territory, resources, ideology, religion, ethnicity, and sometimes for reasons that even they could not clearly articulate. They had developed weapons of extraordinary destructive capability and used them against each other. They had created systems of governance and then torn them down. They had built civilizations that spanned their world and then watched them collapse into chaos, only to build new ones on the ruins. And through all of it, through every catastrophe and conflict and self-inflicted wound, they had not only survived, they had advanced. They had reached their own orbit within a few thousand years of discovering basic metallurgy. They had walked on their own moon within a single lifetime of achieving powered flight. They had expanded into their solar system, and then beyond it, building ships and stations and colonies with a speed that the survey team described as unsettling. They did not advance despite their conflicts. They advanced because of them. Competition drove them. Adversity sharpened them. Every disaster they inflicted upon themselves became fuel for the next leap forward, as if the species had evolved to treat catastrophe as a catalyst rather than a setback. The survey data suggested that most humans considered the galaxy to be effectively empty. They armed their colony ships because they expected to encounter each other. The weapon systems that had destroyed Fleet Korath 9 were designed by humans to defend against other humans. We had been destroyed by their internal security measures, by the precautions they took against themselves. I sat with that thought for a long time. A species so accustomed to conflict that they built their homes with weapons in the walls. A species that looked out at the vast emptiness of space and assumed that the most dangerous thing they would find there was another human. And they were probably right. The colony transport had a registry code, a serial number embedded in its identification broadcast. It was vessel number 4447. I had assumed this was an arbitrary numbering system, a sequential identifier assigned at construction. But something about Korath Den's words, his warning, his carefully controlled expression when he spoke about the 4 ships that came home, made me look at that number differently. The data was fragmentary, pulled from intercepted transmissions and the colony transport's own navigational database. But the number I found was clear enough. There were over 11,000 active vessels in the human colonial fleet alone. The ship that had destroyed Fleet Korath 9, the ship that had fought 12 warships to a standstill and then chased the survivors across space, was vessel 4,447 out of 11,000. It was not their strongest or their largest or their most heavily armed. It was one of the smaller classes in their fleet. An ordinary ship, on an ordinary mission, carrying ordinary people to an ordinary new home. And their military vessels? The ships actually designed for combat? The data did not include them. The humans classified their military fleet under a protocol the intercepted transmissions referred to as operational security. The numbers were hidden, unavailable, unknown. 50,000? I realized that I had no way to estimate, because I had no framework for understanding a species that armed its cargo ships well enough to destroy professional warships and still considered those weapons an afterthought. I closed the data files, I saved my analysis, and I wrote my final report. The recommendation section was short. I wrote it in the largest script that the formal format would allow, a minor breach of protocol that I did not care about, because I needed whoever read this document to understand the importance of what I was saying. Do not enter their space. Do not give them a reason to notice us. They are not conquerors. They do not seek us out. They are not interested in our territory, our resources, or our civilization. They are building outward, expanding into the unclaimed reaches, and they are content to leave us alone as long as we extend them the same courtesy. But if provoked, they will not stop until the provocation is answered. We destroyed one of their colony ships. They destroyed 12 of our warships. They lost hundreds of their people. We lost 9,000 of ours. And they did not slow down. They did not negotiate. They did not pause to grieve or recover or reconsider. They kept going. They are still going. Wherever that ship was headed, it will arrive, and the people on board will step out into a new world and build a new home. And within a generation, they will have towns and cities and industries, and within 2 generations, they will be building ships of their own. They will keep expanding, keep building, keep growing, because that is what they do. That is all they do, and we cannot stop them. Fleet Korath 9 proved that. The Rethian proved that. The humans' own history proves that. Nothing in this galaxy has ever stopped them for long, not even themselves. I filed the report. I sent copies to every relevant authority in the Dominion, from the Military Council to the Diplomatic Corps to the Exploration Directorate. I flagged it at the highest priority level, a designation I had never used before in 40 cycles. Then I went home. My quarters are small, a single room on the residential level of the archival complex, with a narrow window that looks out on the stars. I have sat at that window 1,000 times over the course of my career, looking at the darkness between the distant lights, and I have always found it peaceful. The void is quiet. It is empty. It is safe. I thought about Claire Morgan, standing in a corridor with nothing but her own body between the soldiers and the children behind her. I thought about the repair crews on the exterior hull, working in vacuum while their ship chased a fleet of warships across the void. I thought about the humans in the escape pods, aimed at alien ships, knowing they were riding improvised missiles with no guarantee of survival and no plan for return. I thought about Dorath K's last words. They simply refuse. And I thought about vessel number 4,447 and the 10,553 others just like it, and the military fleet behind them, whose numbers no one knew. I have studied the records of every species the Thaleri have encountered in 6,000 cycles of spacefaring civilization. I have read about predators that hunt for sport, empires that conquer for glory, and machine intelligences that expand because their programming tells them to. I have cataloged the ways in which life in this galaxy fights and kills and competes for survival. Humans are not like any of them. Humans are survivors. They do not fight because they want to. They do not fight because they enjoy it, or because their culture glorifies it, though some of their cultures do. They fight because, somewhere deep in the architecture of their biology, deeper than thought, deeper than reason, deeper than the thin layer of civilization they have built over the raw machinery of their instincts, there is something that refuses to stop. They have been fighting since before they had language. They fought the predators on their homeworld with rocks and sticks and fire. They fought each other with bronze and iron and steel. They fought disease with medicine, ignorance with education, gravity with rocket fuel, and the limitations of their own world, with a stubbornness that turned a fragile species on a single small planet into an interstellar civilization in the span of a few thousand years. They are not the smartest, they are not the most technologically advanced, or the most numerous, or the most strategically sophisticated. They are a middling species, from a middling world on the outer edge of an unremarkable spiral arm, and by every objective measure, they should not be here. They should have gone extinct a dozen times over, consumed by their own conflicts, crushed by their own catastrophes, swallowed by the vast indifference of a universe that does not care whether any particular species survives or fails. They are here because every time the universe tried to end them, they refused. Every time they were beaten, they got back up. Every time they were pushed to the edge of oblivion, they found something inside themselves, some reserve of will and fury and desperate, unreasonable hope that carried them through to the other side. That is what HFY faced. Not a warship, not a military force, not a superior civilization. He faced a colony transport full of ordinary people who had inherited 100,000 years of refusing to die. And when he threatened them, they responded the only way their species knows how. They fought, they adapted, they endured, and they kept going. I locked my office the next morning. I walked to the window one more time and looked out at the stars. The void stretched before me, vast and dark, and full of silence. But it did not feel empty anymore. Somewhere out there, in the space between the stars, the humans were moving, building, growing, spreading outward into the galaxy with a determination that nothing in the known universe had ever managed to match. They were not coming for us. They did not even know we existed. Not really. Not in any way that mattered to them. We were a footnote in their journey, a minor obstacle on the road to wherever they were going. And that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. We had sent our best fleet, our most decorated commander, 12 warships carrying 9,000 of our finest soldiers. We had thrown everything we had at a single ship full of farmers and doctors and engineers, and we had been swept aside like dust. And to the humans, it was not even a war. It was not a battle they would celebrate, or a victory they would commemorate. It was a delay, an incident, something that happened on the way to somewhere else. They would build their colony. They would name their streets and plant their gardens, and raise their children under an alien sun. And in a generation, maybe two, the Battle of Fleet Korath 9 would be a story that grandparents told at dinner, a tale of the time the ship ran into some trouble on the way to the New World. Not a legend, not an epic, just a story, just something that happened. Because to them, surviving was not remarkable. It was not heroic or extraordinary or worthy of special notice. It was just what they did. It was what they had always done. I turned away from the window. I went back to my desk. I opened my datapad and checked for new assignments. There were none. For the first time in 40 cycles, the queue was empty. The Dominion had received my report, and somewhere in the halls of military command, people were reading it. People were looking at the same data I had seen, hearing the same recordings, staring at the same image of a broken ship still burning its way across the stars. I did not know what they would decide. I did not know if they would heed my warning or dismiss it, if they would choose caution or pride, if they would leave the humans alone or make the same mistake that HFY had made. But I knew what I hoped. I hoped they would listen. I hoped they would read the 9 words the Rethown had carved into their academy wall and understand them. I hoped they would look at the number 4,447 and comprehend what it meant, really comprehend it, in the deep and quiet place where understanding lives. Leave them alone. Not because we are afraid, not because we are weak, but because we are wise enough to recognize that some things in this galaxy are best left undisturbed. Some currents are too strong to swim against. Some fires are too hot to touch. And some species, born in hardship and forged by 100,000 years of refusing to break, are not enemies to be conquered. They are forces of nature, and you do not declare war on a storm. You let it pass. And I sat in the dark of my office, listening to the hum of the station around me, and I thought about a ship full of ordinary people who had looked at 12 warships and decided, without hesitation, without doubt, without any consideration that they might fail, that they were going to fight, and win, and keep going, as if nothing had happened at all.